So, Stephen, thanks for joining me today on this conversation about change. Just a quick introduction of yourself. You're the president and founder of Habanero Consulting Group, and we're about making a change in the world around the way people experience their work, making work lives better. And I'd love to hear your perspective on, why this conversation about change is important to the work that we do to start off.
Yeah, when we started working in this organization, Habanero, when we first got going on it, we were really focused on technology, and we quickly realized that what was really happening was that people were having to work differently, collaborate differently. So this idea of human-centered change has been embedded in our work from the very beginning, and it really became this opportunity for us to explore, on a broader and broader context, what is it that gets in the way of people's change, and what is it that helps people be more successful with change, and it's so connected to our pursuit of great employee experiences that it's really at the core of what we do. And I would say change is everything we do in organizations involves change, and so we can label it as other activities in a lot of cases, but it's all change. And so that applies for the stuff we do inside of Habanero for ourselves and the work that we do with our clients as well.
And maybe you could go into just a tiny bit of when someone's listening and they hear the word change, what kind of change are we talking about? Is there something that's bigger than a bread box here? What kind of defines the kind of organizational change that we're referring to when we use that word?
That's a great question. I feel like it's a deceivingly important question, because what we run into a lot is we are brought in to help people sometimes implement technology, for example, and it's too often thought of as technology implementation, and maybe the prize at the end is adoption, when really what's happening is change. In some cases, we're asking people to change what they do every hour of every day. That's significant, right? Or how they relate to the people they work with. In other cases, it's grander and it's more classically thought of as change, where our culture is this way now, and we want our culture to be this way in the future. How do we what's our journey along there to get from one place to the other? So it can be change is change, whether it's focused on a small project, as long as it involves humans, there's some change element, all the way to these grand, digital transformation or organizational change or culture change, these kind of big, large-scale things that are run around dimensions like trust or agility, or these big dimensions, but it's all change. It's all different scale and different versions of the same ideas.
So whether or not you're a listener who's implementing some technology and your idea is the change is going to be created from people starting to use that technology and behave in a different way, or you're in this larger initiative around a transformation the organization needs to work, and the sort of cultural behaviors that will get you to that new destination need to be altered or changed, like that this conversation applies to both those scenarios.
I think absolutely, yeah.
When we sat down to talk about this conversation, one of the things that I think emerged for me was this thesis that change isn't working, that the current approaches and the current ways that people go about thinking about change are antiquated, and that the net result of that is people get to the end of it and they're hitting their heads against the wall because the things they intended to change didn't really actually move at all. Would you agree with that thesis for this conversation? And maybe do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence to say that the current practices related to change and change management specifically are not being as productive as they need to be. I feel like there's some macro trends supporting the ever decreasing effectiveness of current change strategies, and then there's some, I think, new techniques and revelations that have spurred different ways of going about it, and just the field is growing. So the net effect of that is I think we find a lot of organizations that are starting to get curious about the new paradigm of change. And so I would describe the old world and the new world as, the old world is you identify an aspiration to be different. You send out some people in the organization to do some analysis, some investigation. You might send out business analysts and things like that. And you come back, and basically a bunch of smart people in the room, maybe with a facilitator, maybe with a designer, they sit in front of a wall and they they design the future, and they come up with a new fill in the blank strategy, approach, process, culture,
Incentive.
solution, incentive, whatever it is, and then they go forward and they launch it, and they bring in the change management people, and they train people, they communicate to them, but there's this change process that starts as a kind of a project at the end of the design process for what the future will be. And so that's how change has been done so far, and that's largely how the idea behind ProSci and ADCAR. But the new world of change is more human-centered, and it has some really important different characteristics. And one of them is that change should happen all the way through a process. I'm actually stepping back a little bit. Everything we're working on is change. I mentioned this at the front of this conversation. If we're implementing new software or developing a new strategy or putting on a new system, it's going to change. It's going to be change for people. And it might not be a huge change, but you ought to think about all these things as change. It's not a software project. It's not a new process initiative. It's not a new strategy. It's change for people. It's those things as well, but we need to consider that as change. So we need to start from the beginning thinking about the change as we design the process. We can't come up with a new future without thinking about the change journey to get there.
So that comment, even in the way that you just described it, does find the face of the idea of what change is, in that most organizations think of something that they need to do, and then they go get the change department to do the change piece. Like, we've recently had a client talk about their experience of like engaging with their change management group, and they talked about overlaying the change,
right?
Which is like this like distinct and different thing than the change they're trying to create. It's this like thing you apply. It's not, and that's not our belief.
Right. We've heard organizations pejoratively refer to their change management group as the posters and training people, and it's kind of an add-on. It's almost an afterthought, I'm afraid to say, at the end of a project, versus thinking about the entire thing as change and building it out that way.
Probably much to the sadness of the people in the change department who want to be involved.
They don't want to work
other
that
parts
way
of the
either.
process.
They're smart people who really, who deserve to work with greater effect to change the organizations they work in. Yeah.
Maybe just to set up this conversation a bit more, because you sort of whetted our appetite for this. Let's talk about the macro trends that we're seeing, because I think they're really an important anchor as to like describing or helping people understand why we have such a perhaps unique or emergent perspective on what needs to change around change. What do you think the macro trends are in this space?
Right. So we are seeing some really interesting things. If you step back far enough, we're going from an economy that's dominated by tasks that are largely, going back into the 50s, manufacturing economy, and tasks are mechanical, repeatable, require low creativity. And so that trend has been changing steadily since the 50s. I know that's when the U.S. Bureau of Labor started measuring, and I'm sure it's been trending even longer than that. But much more of the economy, a very high percentage of all the jobs require creativity. There's lots of data that talks about the increase in the requirement of people to work in teams, so that we've got people, we need more people's creativity. We need them to collaborate and work more. And so the performance and output of our organizations is more and more dependent on this kind of really intangible, amorphous human performance element. So before, we could come up with these strategies that address the problems, and they would be relatively successful because we had known unknowns. And now we're in a more we're going from a complex to more of a complicated to a more complex realm, if you use a Kinefin framework idea. And we're dealing with a lot more unknown unknowns, and it's much more complex and nuanced to orient a group of people who are relying more on putting them in the position where they can do their best work and bring their best creative selves to their jobs, and they have to do that in an environment where they're supporting other people to do that. So as you can appreciate, this is a different environment. So the old ideas of change don't fit in this new world where we're demanding new things from the people in our organization, and and our industries are more competitive. And the organizations that continue to rely on or continue to be satisfied with people showing up and doing mediocre work and not really set up to win, and the output of that, if they're satisfied with that, they're not going to be very competitive in their industries, and they're going to struggle. So there's competitive forces also driving that. There's competitive forces that are driving even our ability to attract and retain great talent. And so there's a bunch of these dynamics that are at play that are making organizations much more complex, that require us to take a more human-centered view of change overall.
And just adding one to that list too, that like the pace is changing too, like the pace of technology, the pace of what other people are doing. Maybe it's nested in that competitive comment there, but just the pace in general that people need to respond to on a regular basis within organizations quite changed.
Yeah, the world has proved to us quite a bit in the last decade that organization, it doesn't matter if you're 150 or 300 years old in a well-established organization, everyone's subject to going out of business and or the industry changing so fast that they can't keep up with it. That didn't exist 50 years ago. That kind of dynamic market, this pace of change, as you said, just wasn't what it is now.
So these things that you mentioned, more human involvement, the more teaming and collaboration to get work done, more sort of intellectual interplay, more complex environments to have all that perhaps happening in the pace of change and competition. Like all of these are the reason leaders are getting to the end of some massive transformation or change that they're trying to make. And they look around and they say, wow, we've changed processes, we've developed a new org structure, we have new incentives, and yet, why do I still feel like people are just doing the same thing they used to do?
Why are we getting the same result?
Yeah. So that's a great framing for our point of view on this. Maybe you could paint a picture for me of the potential for change. This idea of what does the world or an organization look like at the other side of kind of detaching from these current, perhaps antiquated tools, or maybe they're like adding to them because they're not necessarily going to throw everything away.
Totally.
What's on the other side?
So let me start by being slightly philosophical and expose my deeply held beliefs about humans. I really get a real visceral, deep down in my heart reaction when I hear people say things like, oh, that person will never change, or we'll always be this way, or there's this sort of fixed mindset when people are thinking about other humans. Curiously, they think of themselves as highly flexible, but a lot of people tend to look at other groups of people or people and just think that's the way they are and they'll always be that way. And it always breaks my heart just a little bit to hear that, because my experience is that human beings are so wonderfully flexible and adaptable. They're incredible that way. And so my personal dream is that we live in a world in the future where we all have a higher level of expectation about the potential for human beings and our ability to adapt and change. So that's one part of the answer, and it's very personal. Right. The other is organizationally. There's this phrase you always hear, change is hard. Like you're going to battle, or we're getting in the trenches, but humans thrive during change. If you look back in your life and you think about the most fulfilling, amazing things you've gone through, they might have been really hard work, they might have been difficult, and they might have been a real challenge, but they were also really fulfilling. And so rather than just sticking with change is hard and thinking of it as something to be avoided because it's difficult, I would love people to think about, there are hard elements of change, but man, this is going to be amazing, and we're all going to end up better off because of it. There's a not so subtle change in the psychology or appreciation or conceptualization of change when people cross that divide from thinking about change as a difficult and nasty and something to avoid versus something to lean into because it's a great opportunity to enrich our lives and make a better organization. That's another thing. I feel like when you get into human-centered change and human-centered design ideas, you start to build this, what I would call organizational empathy. And it's this capability in your organization to stay more connected to what's inside the hearts and minds of the people in the organization. and always be curious about it. And you get away from these assumptions about where people are at, and you get curious about stepping into and continue learning more about it. So I feel like the future of change isn't like, oh, change. It's not some, like, we're all constantly changing, so change is easy, because we'll always be stepping into things that are really difficult and challenging to get into. But the future of change will be really led by empathy. It will be processes that start, middle, and end are focused on really understanding where people are at in the journey. And I'm not talking about coddling people, or I'm not talking about anything like that, but I'm talking about really facing the facts and the realities and the truths about what the behaviors and the beliefs are that underlie people's propensity or ability to move quickly in some areas, and what creates friction or holds them back in other areas.
That's great. I think all of those points of view about what the potential is for the future, I think each of those will resonate differently with different people too.
Yes.
I think that idea of human potential, I know not everyone's there with this idea that the world is full of a bunch of people with a bunch of potential. But
I think people are kind of beat down by trying to get into it and trying to, their view of where people should be not matching what those people's view is, and it feels like, oh, it's so hard to get people to change, and I kind of think it's because we're going at it the wrong way.
Yeah, for sure. There's this idea, as I am in the market talking to people about change, there is this sort of like gripping the handlebars moment of like, okay, I got to hunker down right now, which seems
brace yourself.
Yeah, this is going to be challenging, which is makes a lot of sense when you say that. So with all of that as context for this conversation, I'm going to circle back to something that you said that kind of anchors a perhaps like significant point of view for Habanero, and that's this idea that everything is change that you mentioned. And it triggers two things for me. One is, I was at this recent roundtable, and it was directors, a few VPs in the room, but mostly director level people in the organization, trying to create some change in their organization around the digital toolkit, like implementing cloud technologies, Office 365. And their idea of change was like getting people to use the tools. And yet all of them, adoption, kind of a proxy for usage. And yet they all talked to this executive idea that there was something bigger, there was a larger potential that was there. And they just didn't have the idea of that as part of their belief or desire, or I don't even know what you'd call it. But if we're trying to relate this conversation to them, I think this idea that everything is change actually is kind of instructive to like behind and unpacking adoption is actually something kind of more meaty. Or maybe something with higher potential.
Aiming for adoption is a pretty low bar. It's not very inspiring. If we're going to invest, like one way to think about it is that every leader in every organization needs to be great at change. So I don't care if you're in finance or HR or IT or the CEO or whatever. Your job is to create change, successful change in the organization. And so thinking about my job is actually just to implement software and get people to use it. You could do that. You could find them on their, they could take their bonus away if they don't. There's lots of ways to do it that don't actually meet the bar of successful change. But that's your job as a leader. And I think it's that simple, right? It's a key part of your job as a leader.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what I love about this idea of hunkering down with this curiosity around everything is change is maybe instructing those people to lean into what's the real change that you're trying to make in the organization that's going to have the impact on the organization that is meaningful, to walk away from this process and this adoption, if you will, with something that feels like it had a genuine impact. And it's the technology space, when we use the term digital transformation, it's rife with these really neat ideas of new boundless ways of collaborating and transparency and openness and psychological safety, and the idea of like great teaming. And yet all of those things seem out of reach for someone that's just kind of implementing digital tools.
That's not my mandate.
Yeah.
And we're picking on IT leaders here. This shows up everywhere. Like I just had a conversation today about a senior leadership team who's contemplating a new, like altering the business model of the organization, and they're thinking about it as a strategy. Well, there is a strategy there, but this is change too. Just like implementing new software, we have this tendency to over-intellectualize the mechanics of the process and technology bits and completely underrepresent the human element of everything that's going on. And it shows up all over the business. Senior people, senior leadership team, IT, HR, everywhere.
You have this really interesting story that I've heard that we were helping an organization. I'm going to tell the story and you can tell me if I'm right. We were helping the organization that had an intent and a desire to be more agile, unpack some of the beliefs that sat at different levels in the organization around why the organization was struggling with adapting kind of more agile approaches to implementing projects, implementing programs of work. And so the work there was to sort of go in and lean in and understand that what was there for this sort of middle layer in the organization. But there's a really interesting exercise to me that was about trying to connect the leaders in the organization with the people on the ground that were trying to implement the work. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that exercise was.
Yeah, so we had an agile project team bombing away, trying to work differently, quite a bit differently in the organization. And we had senior leaders who were very committed to the idea of being agile, but a lot of their behaviors showed up in a way that, let's just say, was not very helpful for the agile team being successful. So there's big gaps in intent and behavior. And so we did something called a fishbowl. And what that involved was getting the agile team together to sitting in a room, literally sitting in the middle of a large room in a circle of chairs with one empty chair. And they were doing a project retrospective where they were reviewing the previous sprint. And around that chair were tables, and in the chairs and the tables were, and this is a very hierarchical organization, were senior leaders in the organization. Like, I'm thinking maybe 4 or 5 levels above the poor people in the chairs in the middle of the room. And so what the rules of engagement were that you couldn't say a word unless you're sitting in one of the 5 chairs in the middle of the room. So if someone in the outside had a question or wanted to engage in some of the conversation, they would have to put up their hand, get noticed, and be asked to come sit in the chair in the group. So you have one person that can go sit in the chair, and so they enter the team's conversation, and it has this amazing ability to break down the hierarchical construct that tends to really wreak havoc with psychological safety for people on the team. It's very hard for people. It was very hard for people on that team to express really what was going on to them in this setting. But when the people on the outside of the room, the senior people, came and sat down in that session and asked their questions, you could see them shift into the language of the team. So it became a conversation at the level and in the context of the team, and it was such a great learning experience for the team, but more importantly for all those senior executives. And it had a huge impact on their appreciation and understanding of the complexity of what they're trying to take on. And one of the big problems with change is that we're very impatient and we think, well, I understand where we should be. I don't understand why other people don't. And that was one of those exercises where everyone realized, we're actually in for something pretty significant here. And this is way more complex and nuanced and also worthwhile than we thought it was originally. So it's a super powerful exercise.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to that everything is change comment in the beginning here, which is, at different levels in the organization, the idea of what it's going to take in order to enact that change is going to be really different. So I love that exercise is a way of getting into distinguishing these different viewpoints and altitudes around the change and getting people on the same page of what this change is, and what needs to happen in the organization. You've mentioned, so going on to another point, you've mentioned this idea of future leaders are going to be basically change leaders in their organizations, and this idea I formed in my head around when you said that, this developing an empathetic muscle in the organization. Maybe you can describe to me this point of view of what does it mean to build an empathetic muscle in the organization when it comes to change? Like our processes around change are like a whole bunch of people get in a room, they make some decisions around things that need to happen or change. They maybe even start to create the plan of how that's going to happen, and then they perhaps at this stage, maybe start to engage a change management department to kind of enact the change. But then, like, human beings get in the way because that's what human beings do.
So pesky.
Yeah. So what does developing this empathetic muscle mean to those groups?
Yeah, it's interesting. We like David Gray's analogy of being. The trick is to be on the dance floor executing some complicated ballroom dance maneuver and really knowing where your feet are and where your partner are and where you are relative to the dancers all around you. But simultaneously being able to be on the balcony and see the dance floor and see the broader movement of everything and everything that's going on. And it's very hard to be in the system and understand the system at the same time. So another way to phrase that is it's very hard to be objective and have objective insights into what's going on in your organization. When you're in the organization, it's just really hard. So one of the routes to building this empathetic muscle is finding ways to get that objectivity. And so by its very nature, by definition, culture is we talked about this in our last webinar, the under the water level behaviors and beliefs that are so rote, that are so subconscious in your organization. They just happen every day, every minute of every day with everyone in the organization that you don't even notice them. And so how do you unpick those behaviors and the beliefs and the ones that count and matter for the change initiative you're on? So that objectivity becomes super important when you're trying to get in and discern what those things are. And so getting back to your question about how do you become more empathetic, there are tools and techniques for doing it. And it sounds very self-serving, but one of the obvious things is to just have outsiders come in and observe your organization because they're not in the system. And the themes that emerge to us when we go into organizations are super loud and clear to us, but they're not to the people in the organization. It's kind of funny. It's like, I'm a little bit older now, and high-pitched noises my kids can hear and I can't. It's sort of we're sort of like the kids in that analogy. So getting in the organization, getting some support sometimes from external organizations or perspectives, rather, I think is a better way to say it. But also there are skill sets around what we call empathetic research, around building capabilities around using tools where you're having conversations and or workshops where you're putting people in moments of high psychological safety, and you're allowing them not to prognosticate about the future or comment on the State of the Union or anything like that, or share their ideas for strategy, but you want them to share something they're deeply expert at, their own personal experiences. So one of the routes to building that empathetic muscle is building a strength around collecting and understanding, interpreting and synthesizing people's experiences in the organization without proxies, without political interpretation, but actually getting the honest truths out of people, synthesizing those things and pulling the themes out of that. That's another route to build that kind of organizational empathy that's so powerful and so absolutely 100% required for real change.
Maybe I jumped ahead there too, because we just talked about the how you could build that empathetic muscle, but the real reason one would go about that in this idea of a change journey is to look at these and insightful beliefs and behaviors and use those insights as levers for the change, whether it be to identify the kind of blockers and the things that are going to get in the way, or the things that are going to accelerate the change.
Right. Just to put a point on that, I feel that there's this really simple model of, we are here today. We want to go there in the future, roughly speaking. Organizations are almost always very unclear about where we are today. They know a lot about it, but they don't know the behaviors and beliefs, especially the beliefs that really matter, that hold them there today. So they need help discerning that. So part of that is actually really understanding the problem that they're solving. So we help a lot in that area. But from there, you're really well prepared to chart the path to the future. And if you're smart about it, you're actually co-creating it based on all that uncovered knowledge that you gained, understanding where you are today versus, having this big guess about the future, the smart people in the room designing the future idea. You're actually involving people in it.
So this idea of using empathy, identifying all these beliefs, behaviors. I'm going to say this stories, lived experiences, setting up a psychological safety. I think even using all those words in the constructs of employees is so distinct from what change management might call it, which is like stakeholder analysis.
Right.
Like we've just kind of blown the idea of stakeholder analysis up quite a bit, because it's way more nuanced and it's way more intimate, and it just requires a different set of empathetic tools than I think kind of modern change management practices.
Yeah, one of the ideas that you pointed out to me, Brian, that drives me crazy about ADKAR is like there's an element in it that's really, and I'm being very unfair by characterizing it this way, and I'm not trying to bag on ADKAR, but you go into the stage and you need to educate or convince the stakeholders about why they should be motivated to move to the feature state. And it just sort of drives me crazy because there's this opportunity to go. These aren't sheep. There's not cattle or some farm animal. Like these are intelligent human beings that are probably, very in tune and connected to their jobs and their roles, and thus have a very unique, knowledgeable perspective on the journey that they have to go through to be successful. So there's just a better, more evolved way of involving them in helping get insight and build towards the future. And whether they're co-creating what that future state is or they're involved more in providing insight that's used to do that, it's just a different level of respect. You're not saying, well, we've designed your future, now we need to convince you and motivate you to get to that future. You're not selling anyone anything. You're actually tying into the motivations, beliefs that exist already, and or unpinning the beliefs that are really unhelpful. And that's totally a different situation.
Right. So, okay. So I'm going to recap the two big points we've made so far is this idea that everything is change. And there's a lot to unpack in that, of course, but some of the kind of key ideas there is that one, this idea that leaders might be underserving their organization by thinking about change as something like adoption, and that there's this higher level order of potential within their organizations. Inside of that, everything is change. And even if they are only thinking about adoption, they need to realize the underpinning behaviors and beliefs and actual effort that it's going to take to make human beings do something different. Yeah. And then the second one is this idea of using empathetic tools to really understand what's there for the organization, sit in someone's lived experience and pull those stories and insights, beliefs and behaviors out as part of the change journey. So now you've started to talk about, and I think this is kind of a third point, is this idea of when that work starts. And what I hear you suggesting is it doesn't start after the leaders have created something. It actually starts in the very beginning because you've used this term, like hopefully we can co-create the future together. Tell me more about this idea of co-creating the future and how that's really distinct from our idea of change right now.
Yeah, I mean, I find that's a super fascinating topic. And to sound slightly judgmental, my experience of this is that leadership teams feel it's their responsibility to clarify what the future is and design it and then push the organization in that direction, when the opportunity is to get the organization involved in refining the ideas and taking the aspirations from the leadership team and the board and the governance, however the company's organized, and building that future together. So it's a very different thing. So the idea of co-creation it's not this sort of democracy of everyone. It's not a Montessori school and everyone gets to decide what, gets to pick a color for the wall in their office. It's actually about leveraging the collective intelligence and insight and understanding of your entire organization in the process of designing the future, and potentially stakeholders outside of your organization too. And, history is proven over and over and over again that many brains working together to solve a problem is much smarter than one single brain or a small group of brains. Yet, this is part of this organizational mythology that, the senior leadership team needs to be the one to plant the flag in the future that we're going to race to. And I think that idea just has to go away. And co-creation shows up in all sorts of positive ways for the people in the organization too. And it's part of the mechanism of why change starts at the beginning of the process, because when you start to involve people in first through empathetic research and understanding their lived experiences, you're actually recruiting their mind into the process of change, and you're opening them up to the future in a really constructive way because they're being heard. Then you have the opportunity to bring those people or subsets of those people or groups of those people into very specific efforts to co-create elements of change that will most affect their part of the role. And this is, we got to get out of this idea that we can design the perfect experience for everyone and just pass it on to them. We're better have to come into the ideas and the capabilities of the change in the tool set or whatever we're doing them, and going in and working with that team to help to work with them and facilitate their development of the future. And so that's another big element of change. So people feel really engaged, they feel ownership. And then you get to the end of that process, when people are engaged that way, you don't need change management at that point. They don't need to be trained. They don't need to be convinced that they should be motivated about the future. They built the damn future. They own it. They'll be mad if they don't get there. So it's a very different paradigm.
Yeah, I have a quick little story about a client that we saw this happen at, where they were interested in rolling out a new digital platform, and their idea as a CIO was really quite powerful, which was to change the transparency in the organization, the way that people share information, because IT had a view to the kind of information management craziness, the security and the hiding and hoarding information that had been going on in the organization, not really as a result of anything in particular, but just sort of habits that have been formed over years. And when they first started rolling out the technology, they realized people in the organization still did the same things that they were doing on the old technology stack. And so they introduced a new conversation inside of the organization around this idea of what does transparency look like for us and what does change look like for us around this, and started engaging people in an imagination of what that could look like. And people were coming up with their own ideas on how they could be implementing and changing and using this technology in new ways. And so it's just peeling back the onion a little bit to getting to the meat of the change that you're trying to create, and then working with people on co-creating that really works, because now there's a huge momentum towards this idea of transparency that's not just sort of sitting in the CIO's mind, but it's actually starting to permeate through their organization.
I really like that story, Brian. And one of the things that makes me think of is the idea of fidelity. When you engage the people who will be involved in the change process, you get this this higher resolution of what has to really happen, all the nuances, and you actually have a broader base of an ability to engage in that. So you get more complexity, more nuance, and more ability to take that on, and that's really where the change happens, right? It's a cool. So we're doing this. Working on the idea of raising the bar for trust in an organization that's pushing 100,000 people. And so what we learned in this organization is you can survey and do quantitative analysis till the cows come home, and you can get tons of data, but it's really hard to know, to boil that down into with enough fidelity and clarity to take real action that has a meaningful impact. So the other way to go about it is to use that quantitative data to zoom into areas where you can make an impact, and try iterations or sprints of a little bit of empathetic research and build a prototype of an idea that might change trust, and use it with a bunch of people, get their feedback, and engage with them in the process of co-creating what that prototype is and trying and understanding how successful it was. That's really a really high fidelity, high resolution kind of solution that makes an impact. And you can go from there and scale that, or try more iterations and work on that. And that's a different proposition than trying to boil the ocean and solve that problem through other means that might at the surface seem more efficient because they're involving less people. But it's really hunting for a needle in a haystack using these other approaches, like empathetic research, qualitative analysis at that level. That's when you zoom into the high resolution, high fidelity, clarity that you really need to create meaningful change.
That's great. That's maybe exiting the commentary on this idea of co-creating the future and kind of heading us into another Habanero point of view, which is about this learning process around change that I think lots of organizations fail to be successful at. And this is a big one, because you just used words like sprint and experiment and try. And I think all of these words are fearful words for leaders and organizations.
Right.
They're I think lots of people in organizations don't feel they have the structures to support them underneath those terms.
And they're right.
And the belief. But I think our belief is they absolutely have to get ready for this idea of iteration and being comfortable with elements of failure around this. So maybe can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this wouldn't be a topic if we were smart enough and we had known unknowns and we could get our hands around saying, well, I'm really, really confident that if we did this, this, and this, we'd end up right here. But none of this work around culture and change and pesky human beings plays out this way. As I said, we're in this, we've gone from the complicated world to the complex world, and sometimes even chaotic. So the only way to find our way through this is to experiment and learn and try and be more focused on the learning than we are on the kind of classic measures of productivity. We do a lot of coaching around what some people call enterprise agile, and it's this idea that they're trying to implement work in an agile way, whether it's technology related or not. But you need to actually shift how the organization works around that. And so in that case, because agile is actually focused on iterating and learning and getting to the exact right solution, and avoiding the guessing at the beginning and the belief that whatever you said in the first week of the project will be true at the end of the project. They still exist in organizational constructs where the leaders are saying, okay, that's cool that you're doing agile. Just tell me, the date this will be done, how much it'll cost, and exactly the features or what it'll look like at the end. And it just doesn't work that way. So there is quite a bit to do in organizations to adapt how we think about how work gets done and get away from this idea that anyone in an organization is smart enough to predict the future of exactly how everyone and everything's going to react, to shift our culture from state A to state B, and realize that we have to be adaptive. We have to learn our way through this, and we constantly need to be able to question where we're coming from and question the problem we're solving and go back to those fundamentals of the problem, be able to zoom up in altitude to really think, are we still going in the right direction here? And then zoom into the details and zoom back and forth like that. Otherwise, we'll continually chase objectives that might have been put on built on the wrong foundation. We talked about this early on about in technology, people get the mandate to implement some software. What is the problem we're solving that? What are we really trying to change? And as in the process of going through that implementation process, if we actually learn the problem's different and we're trying to solve different, we're trying to solve something else. And, very few organizations at this point have a lot of flexibility and capability to adapt that way, but it is how organizations have to evolve. They need to develop that capability.
I think that of almost everything we talked about today is going to be maybe one of the hardest things for organizations to wrap their heads around and adopt, because when we've had this conversation of change with leaders in organizations, I think this idea, we're really actually disrupting the way goals are set, where we're disrupting this idea of how people envision the future and then march the organization to it. We're really kind of disrupting this idea of change in general by that concept. But I think there's a lot of momentum around the world. The startup community is a great example of people who have adopted highly attuned failure and learn and respond models, that are addressing that kind of more complex, chaotic ecosystem that more and more companies are operating in.
And it would seem very wrong after all this talk about change if I said organizations just should become that way automatically, because that is a vision of the future that organizations need to think. You need to apply these very ideas of change towards finding their way there. And it is a journey, and it does take a long time. It does take patience, and it does take determination to be different. But it also shouldn't and can't happen all at once. There are smart ways for organizations to find their way in that direction incrementally in a learning way that helps them build confidence and be productive. I would argue more productive right off the bat, but get going and try things in different ways. So there's absolutely ways to do that.
Yeah, what comes to mind instantly is it's not a surprise we're at the table with multiple organizations that are looking to be more agile in their internal processes. We've mentioned one in this conversation, but they're just one of a few who are really troubled by this idea of even shifting cultural behaviors around shifting away from, let's call it a waterfall technique for creating change in the organization. So it's hard, and there's a change journey on making that change.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful as a first step to, I guess, sort of submerge your team in some of the ideas, particularly the leadership team, just to get really comfortable with what these ideas mean and the implications. And I think the knowledge and understanding is really valuable, but I think potentially what's even more valuable is the opportunity for reflection, for leaders to think about how they show up and the behaviors they have that might make these things really hard, or the things that they might be really excited about, their strengths they have to build on in the organization. That would be the green shoots to really get the place to get things going. That's a really constructive way to get going on these things. We find a lot of organizations almost have hidden skunk works for little agile cells that are working to do things better, and it seems to happen mostly in the technology area or IT areas, because that's where a lot of the stuff comes from originally. But we're also finding it in, other areas too, like customer service and different things like that. And so that's great. But I feel like it would be good it would be more constructive rather, if senior leadership teams had started to develop a vision for how their organization could change in this one dimension of their culture, and they leaned into it a little bit more themselves.
Great. So maybe that starts to wrap us up. And I think I'll just quickly go through, just for the listener, some of the key takeaways. Number one, everything is change. Number two, this idea of embedding empathetic research or empathetic muscle within the organization, and identifying the cultural blocks as well as accelerators and the beliefs and behaviors that will affect change. Three, this idea of leveraging the bigger brain in the organization for a co-creation of the future, and being part of that journey of co-creating what that future looks like. And then number four, shifting the organization to be comfortable with this embedded learnings sprint iteration around this change, not assuming that a whole bunch of smart people can completely imagine what the future is going to look like, but know that there's going to be learnings along the way that will change your path. So those are kind of the big four takeaways that are really distinct from our current orientation around change and change management in general. You started to say there this idea of leaders, the first stage of change is leaders to get into room and have these conversations. But perhaps this is where Habanero comes in to help, because it's not uncommon to be called in to a client where there is some big change that they need to make, and they're just kind of trying to figure out how and what to discern inside of that process. Maybe we could just kind of leave people with a way of engaging with us when this is something that they're looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting at those early stages. I think I find what's most constructive is just to show up as a thought partner for leaders to think through, rationalize these ideas into their context, their culture, and their language, frankly, and really start to get clear, build some clarity about how things could be different and what it might be like to get there. And that can start to evolve into working with teams, getting around those ideas. And we're really big believers in the best way to learn things is by doing, not to work on concepts, but to work on real things. So to take things that actually matter, that you have to get done, and try these new techniques with them. So the lovely thing about all these ideas is they scale down to little tiny things that you can take on in a half hour, and they scale up to massive organizational changes that take really long periods of time and involve tens of thousands of people. So starting on the small end of the scale, just getting going and getting the concept and practicing and understanding what is it, how this process we're about to engage that we have to do anyways be a little bit different if we're just a little bit more empathetic, and we involve things a little bit more, involved the people affected by it a little bit more than we would have otherwise. And we, and recognizing that everyone's going through change and it's a learning journey, and being really reflective of how those things worked out. So there's, we want want to work your way into these incrementally and with a real focus on, we're starting to build skills we're not good at. And so we're not going to hop on the ski hill and be an Olympic skier on the first day. We're going to start on the bunny hill. And I think that's really critical to recognize where you're at with all these things.
And just to reiterate something that you've said earlier, I mean, even if, whether they call Habanero in to help them with this change journey or not, I mean, the idea is that whether it's us or someone else, like we're working our way out of a job, because this is the vision of the future is these are change muscles that the empathetic muscle, the listening into the organization, this new way of thinking about the human potential within the organization. The dream state for organizations is that this is something they do all the time.
Right. We're trying to build a permanent capability in the organization. Absolutely, yeah.
Great. Well, I think that kind of summarizes the
That's
talk
it.
around change today. Yeah.
Put a bow on that.
Yeah, thanks for joining me on this conversation around change. I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And if anyone out there has any questions about this, they can feel free to contact myself or yourself about their change journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Brian.